This video will reference details from Metroid Prime 4 that have been noted in previews and from Nintendo's recent overview trailer. If you're trying to go in completely cold to this game, please don't watch any further. Okay, so I didn't plan to make a video on this at all. I saw the Metroid Prime 4 Beyond overview trailer appearing on my feed, and I hesitated for a long time. 7 minutes of footage. I kind of don't want to know a lot, but equally of course I do. However, Nintendo has done a good job of hiding major surprises in recent years, notably the depths in Tears of the Kingdom, so I thought let's have a look and see. And generally speaking, I think it looks great, and to be honest, what stood out to me more than anything else was how Japanese coded it felt like the script to this was. Arch-rival Silux feels like a very Japanese framing to me somehow, like Japan had taken a very strong steer in how this should be marketed and presented. And then of course it talks about the Galactic Federation troopers. It says how you can follow distress signals to help the troopers, battle alongside them, and even work with them collaboratively. The dialogue lines are all fairly generic stuff talking about looking forward to seeing family or whatnot. And my first thought was, huh. Now look, my taste in Metroid games definitely tends towards isolation. Heck, my taste in life tends towards isolation, one reason you probably won't find me on loads of social media platforms. But inevitably, these games are going to try different things. Fundamentally, having a few people scattered around the world who need rescuing could be interesting. It gives a personal hook to challenges which could otherwise be purely logistical. The idea of teaming up with other characters was also rather curious. My first thought went to Kensuke Tanabe's comment in the Metroid Prime art book recently about wanting to work on multiplayer mechanics if there were ever to be a Metroid Prime 2 remake. I feel like this opens the door significantly to co-op as well as competitive mechanics in future games or even in future adaptations of this game. I've seen some people say that this is a desperate move from Nintendo to make the game easier and to hold your hands, or that this is a product of too many new American hires. Here's the thing, I don't think that at all. I don't think that this is something where some American High Plains drifters rode into town and said, Samus needs a posse. This to me screams, absolutely screams, Kensuke Tanabe. I really think this is the vision he's had for the series ever since his last game, which was, let's not forget, Federation Force. He's always said he's had an interest in these troopers, and I think this links to his plot for Silex. And this makes sense because it's evidently quite a core mechanic of the game, and the core mechanics are created in close concert with Japan long before a game is finalized. This all didn't just happen overnight. Now, I haven't liked all of Tanabe's choices in game design over the years, but there's no doubting the man is a genius. Even assuming that this mechanic turns out to be a dreadful dead weight on the play experience, and I'm not by any means saying that it will be at this point, I'm very much of the view that when you have genius-level people like Tanabe or Sakamoto, they're going to take big swings and sometimes they're going to miss, and that's frustrating, but I'd rather an ambitious failure than a safety-first iteration. If Tanabe thinks this is something that will add to the game world, I kind of want to see what his vision is. It also strikes me that this feels like a structural echo of the Breath of the Wild champions and the Tears of the Kingdom sages. Now personally, I could take or leave the champions and sages. I quite like Tulin and Mipha, and Daruk is pretty fun, Sidon of course too. I mean, there aren't really any that I dislike, but if they weren't in the game at all, I don't think I'd miss them, and somehow following these story quests always feels like a departure from what I consider the meat and drink of the Wild games. I certainly would prefer dungeons to be solo experiences for the most part, and I like the isolated atmosphere of especially Breath of the Wild. The thing is though, the champions have provided some benefit to Nintendo over the years. Apart from the sale of Amiibo and the deepening of their popularity through the Warriors titles, the champions give a different kind of set of characters that hopefully broaden the appeal of the central title, perhaps especially in Japan, where larger casts are often of more interest. Now, I'm not sure these Galactic Federation troopers are going to be able to do this, as the designs feel colder and less likely to appeal to a Japanese audience especially. Nevertheless, I think Nintendo has hit on a structure for their games that they feel works, and if it works well, particularly with their larger and more open games, then they're going to want to try it out here. However, Both with the champions and the sages and with these troopers, the sense I get is that Nintendo does have a long-term aim to try and work out how to build multiplayer functionality into both Metroid and Zelda. Both games have had multiplayer titles in the last 10 or so years, and both Tanabi and Aonuma have discussed their interest in this. I know 10 years might seem like a long time ago, but in the scheme of things, given how long these titles to develop, it's actually pretty recent. At the current time, Nintendo are clearly trying to build game chat into the heart of their system offerings, and so while Breath of the Wild and Metroid Prime 4 are showcasing single-player mechanics, you can see the contours of how these elements could one day be expanded if we got to the stage where people were able to play in the same game world using game chat. Of course, there's a difference between the plan and the execution. The problem Metroid has often had over the years is in trying to fill the silence with talking and character, when the world is so often about isolation and wordless atmosphere and that really visceral experience of being on an alien world. And since then, previews have dropped, and I've avoided most of them, frankly, but the impression to have a theme, and the theme is that the Galactic Federation troopers are heavy presences and have a jokey kind of dialogue for the most part. Now, to be clear, this is in the context of the game being amazing in other respects, which I still think will be true. However, it's inevitable that the pattern interrupt is going to be the thing that gets attention, and that's been the case here. There are three things that seem to be particularly aggravating to people. Firstly, the idea of a hand-holding character seemed to have gone out of Nintendo's playbook a long time ago, and was even rather brilliantly satirized in Undertale. Now, that's a fair worry if it's back here, but then again, I do want the game to be accessible to as many people as possible, and so to Nintendo, so perhaps this isn't the worst thing. Secondly, the escort-style missions are something that does give me slight chills, as I personally can't think of any escort mission in a game where I've thought, yes, that was top-tier gameplay. And then the third critique is about the use of humour, and how it clashes with the atmosphere that makes these games so special. Now, I will go out on a limb about humour and tension. They're not necessarily antithetical. Yes, humour is generally used as a tension reliever, but very skilled writers can use it in a different manner. The common point of comparison is Marvel films, and I'm not a massive follower of Marvel movies, but if you look at people like James Gunn and Joss Whedon who pioneered this kind of tone, they're people who have, whatever their flaws, a deep knowledge of film and a great success in the past in using humour to sculpt and sharpen scenes as opposed to simply punctuating tension. Perhaps the most iconic example of using humour to support tension is the Porter scene in the play Macbeth. Macbeth has just murdered the king, and the first third of the play has just been a massive ramp up of tension as we're looking forward to the moment when Macbeth will inevitably kill Duncan. But then we go to a comedy scene with a drunken porter. But this isn't truly, I would argue, a scene of comic relief, because it doesn't provide relief so much as pivot into a new phase of the play. At this point in the play, the suspense has been building on the question of whether Macbeth will commit regicide, and it has built to a fever pitch. But now comes a different kind of tension, the long wait for morning and the discovery of the crime. Having a scene with a drunken porter provides black humour, but is also an elaborate game of keep away. The motor of the tension of the play is still humming around underneath, and even the jokes are dark twists on the play's main themes, playing on the fact that the world of this play is really so much more hellish than even this porter, who thinks he's in hell, supposes. This is what I'd refer to as humour being used to sculpt the texture of a story, to manage pacing, to deepen themes, and there are people who can do it well. However, there aren't many, and most of those writers aren't going to come onto a Metroid game, although if they can get Shakespeare back, obviously that would be pretty impressive. And Metroid has a double problem, which is that it needs to appeal in multiple languages, and the key figures in the US and Japan can't necessarily know what works well in one language will work well in another. Even fluent speakers of both languages would need to have spent a long time in either culture to get those nuances and styles of humour that resonate, and even then, it's not like English language humour is monolithic. They could do what Portal did and hire a top talent like Stephen Merchant, but even if they get the humour right, they need to consider how it intersects with the tension they're trying to build, and that needs to be a judgment in the development. This is just fundamentally a really difficult thing to pull off, and I don't envy Retro at all. Now, If it's true that the game ends up having lots of escort missions and that a significant chunk of the game is played collaboratively with chatty NPCs who ruin the sense of immersion, then yeah, that's a worry. But ultimately for me, I don't feel like I can invest too much worry at this point in the state of a game that is after all just around the corner. We will know for sure in December. And worst case scenario. Look, we've had flawed games before. Skyward Sword is hugely flawed, but also had some of the best and most iconic moments in any Zelda game. Heck, the stuff with the time stones is absolute genius to the point where that could be a film series about time travel completely in its own right. I don't think Nintendo is done with Metroid, and I think they'll continue to kick the tires, and I'm actually supportive of them doing that. As for whether this slightly bitter aftertaste from first review impressions impacts early sales, I kind of doubt it. It's true that Federation Force sank like a stone, but the Metroid fanbase is small enough that it will be completely overwhelmed in numbers by the people picking it up as a curiosity, possibly as their first exposure to the franchise, and I certainly hope that will be the case. Even if a few diehards swear off it, I think it will do low but decent numbers out of the gate, and long-term sales might be more of an issue, but the quality of the game was always going to be one determining factor for the long-term sales, alongside, of course, how well they're able to market it. And the fact is, it seems like whatever else this game may have, it does seem to have a lot of quality content in the classic Metroid Prime style. Anyway, these are my takes. Do let me know what you think. Thanks as ever, thanks to the channel's Patreon backers, and I'll see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.